The heavy brass key felt like a lead weight in my palm, cold and tarnished, just like the look in my husband's eyes when the notary finished reading my grandmother's final wishes. I expected a hug, a shared tear for the woman who had been more of a mother to me than my own. But instead, Mark leaned over and whispered, "Check if the land rights include the mineral veins, Sarah. We can't afford to be sentimental right now." Behind him, my mother-in-law Evelyn was already clutching her silk scarf, her face a mask of practiced sympathy that couldn't quite hide the predatory hunger in her gaze. It was the exact moment I realized that my marriage wasn't a partnership. It was an investment they were both waiting to cash out. They didn't even wait for the body to be cold before they started partitioning the dirt she was buried in. For 7 years, I believed I was living the modern dream. Mark and I had a cozy, sun-drenched colonial in the suburbs, the kind of house where the air always smelled of expensive vanilla candles and freshly ground Arabica beans. Our mornings were a choreographed dance of shared chores and soft kisses. I was a senior architectural designer, and Mark worked in high-end real estate. Or so he told me. We were the golden couple of our social circle, the ones who never fought, the ones who held hands under the table at dinner parties. I poured my entire soul and every cent of my 6-figure salary into our life, renovating our kitchen with Carrara marble and ensuring Mark's suits were always bespoke. I thought I was building a sanctuary, a fortress against the world. My grandmother, Eleanor, had been the only one who saw through the polish. She lived 300 miles away in the deep, untamed woods of the Blackwood Valley, in a cabin that everyone in the family called the Ruin. She was a woman of sharp edges and few words, a retired geologist who preferred the company of pines to people. Whenever we visited, Evelyn would wrinkle her nose at the smell of wood smoke and old books, making snide remarks about eccentricity being a polite word for madness. Mark would just nod, his eyes scanning the perimeter of the property, as if he were already imagining a bulldozer clearing the ancient oaks. "Sarah, darling," Evelyn would say, her voice dripping with that sickly sweet condescension she saved for me. "It's such a shame your grandmother chooses to live like a hermit. Imagine what this land would be worth if someone actually utilized it. A resort, perhaps? Or a luxury timber harvest?" I would always brush it off. "It's her home, Evelyn. She loves the silence." But the silence was gone now. Eleanor had passed away in her sleep, leaving me the cabin and the 40 acres of worthless wilderness surrounding it. To the rest of the family, it was a burden, a decaying shack with a leaking roof and no electricity. To Mark and Evelyn, it was a lottery ticket they hadn't yet figured out how to scratch. The day after the funeral, the atmosphere in our beautiful home shifted. The warmth was sucked out of the rooms, replaced by a clinical, calculating frost. I was sitting at the kitchen island, staring at a photo of Eleanor holding me when I was 5, when Mark walked in. He didn't sit next to me. He stood by the window, his back turned, watching the rain hit the glass. "We need to talk about the Blackwood property, Sarah," he said, his voice devoid of the tenderness he'd used just days before. "I've been doing some research. That shack is sitting on a very specific geological fault. If we play our cards right, we can flip that land to a development consortium I know. We're talking 7 figures, maybe more." I felt a dull ache in my chest. "Mark, she just died. I'm not selling the cabin. I want to go up there, clear it out, maybe spend some time there. It's all I have left of her." He turned then, and for a split second the mask slipped. His jaw tightened, and a flash of genuine irritation crossed his face before he smoothed it over with a practiced, weary sigh. "Honey, be reasonable. We have debts. The renovation on this house cost more than we planned, and my firm is going through a transition. We need this win. My mother agrees. She's already reached out to a contact in the land registry to speed up the title transfer." "She did what?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "Evelyn has no right to touch my inheritance. It's in my name, Mark. Only my name." "We're a family, Sarah," he said, stepping closer and placing a hand on my shoulder. It didn't feel like a comfort. It felt like a claim. "What's yours is ours. My mother is just trying to help. She knows how emotional you get. She's just taking the business side off your plate so you can grieve." That evening, Evelyn showed up unannounced, carrying a bottle of expensive wine and a folder full of documents. She moved through my kitchen as if she owned the air I breathed, pouring herself a glass without asking. "Now, Sarah," she began, spreading maps across my marble countertop, the same maps my grandmother had drawn by hand. "I've taken the liberty of drafting a preliminary agreement. We'll need you to sign over power of attorney for the Blackwood tract. It's just a formality, really. It allows Mark to negotiate with the developers while you find yourself again." I looked at the documents. They were professionally drafted, crisp and cold. My name was everywhere, but the signatures required were for Mark and Evelyn to act on my behalf. "I'm not signing anything, Evelyn," I said, my heart starting to hammer against my ribs. "And I want those maps back. Those were Eleanor's." Evelyn laughed, a sharp metallic sound. "Don't be hysterical, dear. That cabin is a death trap. It's full of rot and shadows. You wouldn't last a night there. Why cling to a pile of junk when you could have a life of true luxury? Think of the travel, the clothes, the security." "I have security," I countered, looking at Mark, hoping for a shred of support. Mark stayed silent. He was leaning against the refrigerator, swirling the wine in his glass, refusing to meet my eyes. He looked at the floor. He looked at his watch. He looked at his mother. He looked everywhere but at me. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. In that quiet, I realized he wasn't just being practical. He was part of the plan. He had been briefed before I even knew the will had been read. "I'm going up there tomorrow," I announced, my voice trembling but firm. "I'm going to the cabin, alone. I need to see what's actually there before I listen to another word about developers or mineral veins." Evelyn's eyes narrowed into slits. "You're being very difficult, Sarah. Eleanor always said you were the stubborn one. It's a shame you didn't inherit her sense of self-preservation." "I think I inherited exactly what I needed," I snapped back. That night, I lay in bed next to Mark, feeling the vast, invisible chasm that had opened between us. He reached out to touch my arm, but I flinched away. "You're making a mistake, Sarah," he muttered into the darkness. "You don't know what's waiting for you in those woods. My mother, she's just looking out for us. Don't throw our future away for a ruin." I didn't answer. I just clutched the rusted brass key in my hand until it left a deep red imprint on my skin. I didn't know then that the ruin was the least of my problems. I didn't know that inside that cabin, hidden beneath the floorboards and the dust of 60 years, lay a secret that would turn my entire understanding of my marriage, my family, and my own life into a pile of ash. I only knew that I had to leave. I had to get away from the vanilla-scented house and the husband who was already spending money that wasn't his. I had to go to the wilderness, even if it broke me. The drive to Blackwood Valley was a 5-hour descent into a landscape that felt increasingly alien, as if the towering pines were closing in to keep me from turning back. My mind was a whirlwind of minor inconsistencies I'd ignored for months. Why had Mark suddenly started working late 3 nights a week, yet our joint savings account remained stagnant? Why had Evelyn been so insistent on helping me organize my grandmother's estate papers, only for me to find several original deeds missing from the file just hours before I left? Every time I'd asked Mark about the missing papers, he'd give me that same rehearsed, pitying smile. "You're just stressed, Sarah. Grieving minds play tricks. I probably put them in the safe deposit box for security. Don't worry about it." But as the tires of my SUV crunched over the gravel of the long-abandoned logging road leading to the cabin, the stress felt more like a cold, hard intuition. I pulled up to the structure, and my heart sank. It was worse than I remembered. The ruin was a skeletal thing of gray, weathered wood, half swallowed by creeping ivy and shadow. The porch sagged like a broken jaw, and the windows were clouded with decades of grime. This was what my husband was so eager to sell for millions. It looked like it would collapse if I sneezed. I stepped inside, the air heavy with the scent of damp cedar and ancient dust. It took me hours just to clear enough cobwebs to reach the kitchen table. I worked until my muscles ached, trying to drown out the memory of Mark's last phone call before I'd lost cell service. He hadn't asked if I was safe. He'd asked, "Did you find the surveyor's stakes near the North Creek yet?" By dusk, I was exhausted and shivering. I decided to build a fire in the massive stone hearth. As I reached into the wood box, my hand brushed against something that didn't feel like pine or oak. It was smooth, cold metal. I pulled it out, a heavy, modern crowbar, polished and new. It looked wildly out of place in this tomb of relics. My heart began a slow, heavy thud against my ribs. Someone had been here recently. Someone who wasn't an 80-year-old woman. I looked at the floorboards near the hearth. One of them was slightly raised, the edges scuffed. Using the crowbar, I pried it up. My breath hitched as the wood groaned and gave way, revealing a shallow cavity. Inside was a waterproof plastic case, the kind hikers use for electronics. With trembling fingers, I opened it. I expected old photos or maybe some hidden jewelry. Instead, I found a thick stack of documents, all dated within the last 6 months. My eyes scanned the first page, and the world began to tilt. It was a contract for sale of mineral rights for the Blackwood property. The buyer was a shell corporation I didn't recognize. The seller's name at the bottom made my stomach turn, Mark Hastings. But it was the signature next to his that stopped my heart. Sarah Hastings. The signature was a perfect replica of my own. The loops of the S, the specific way I crossed my T's, it was flawless. I felt a sudden, violent surge of nausea. I dropped the paper as if it were white hot. "No," I whispered to the empty room. "No, this can't be." I dug further into the case. There were more papers. A life insurance policy on my name, taken out 4 months ago, with a payout that made my head spin. Mark was the sole beneficiary. Beneath that was a series of bank statements for an account I'd never heard of. It showed massive deposits, loans taken out against our suburban home, money I thought was sitting safely in our retirement fund. Mark hadn't just been managing our finances, he had been cannibalizing our entire life. He'd mortgaged our house to the hilt to fund some development scheme that had clearly failed, and now he was using my grandmother's land and my own identity to bail himself out. Then I found the last item in the box, a small handheld GPS device and a handwritten note in Evelyn's elegant, sharp script. "Mark, the geologist confirmed the lithium deposit is concentrated under the cabin's foundation. The accident needs to happen here. Make sure she's inside when the floor joists fail. The old woman's death was easy. This shouldn't be any harder. Don't lose your nerve now. Mom." The paper fluttered from my hand, drifting to the dusty floor. The silence of the woods, which had seemed peaceful hours ago, now felt like a predatory weight. The old woman's death was easy. My grandmother hadn't just passed away in her sleep. They had killed her, and I was next. A cold sweat broke out across my forehead. My legs felt like lead, and I had to lean against the stone mantel to keep from collapsing. The roaring in my ears was so loud, I almost didn't hear the sound of a car engine in the distance. I froze. The cabin was miles from the nearest neighbor. No one should be out here. I scrambled to the window, wiping a circle in the grime. Far down the logging road, 2 sets of headlights were cutting through the darkness, bouncing over the ruts as they sped toward the cabin. I knew those lights. I knew the aggressive way Mark drove his luxury SUV. He wasn't waiting for me to come home. He was coming here to finish the transaction. I looked around the dark, cramped cabin. I had no cell service, no weapon, and the only road out was currently being blocked by the man I had loved for 7 years. My pulse was a frantic drumming in my throat, and for a moment, the sheer weight of the betrayal threatened to paralyze me. Everything I thought I knew, my marriage, my safety, my husband's character, was a lie constructed by a predator. "You're not dying here, Sarah," I hissed to myself, the words cracking in the cold air. I looked at the crowbar in my hand. I looked at the hole in the floor. My eyes landed on a heavy iron ring bolt set into the corner of the cellar door, nearly hidden under a tattered rug. Eleanor had always told me, "In the woods, Sarah, the most dangerous thing isn't the wolf. It's the trap you don't see." I realized then that this cabin wasn't just a ruin, It was Eleanor's final lesson. She knew they were coming for her. She had left me the evidence, and she had left me a way out. I just had to be fast enough to take it. The headlights were closer now, the engine's roar echoing off the trees. I grabbed the waterproof case, shoved the documents inside my jacket, and blew out the single candle I'd lit. The darkness swallowed me whole, but for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of the shadows. I was part of them. I heard the SUV screech to a halt outside. The car door slammed. "Sarah?" Mark's voice called out, honeyed and fake, vibrating with a tension he couldn't hide. "Honey, you in there? You left your phone on the charger at home. I got worried and drove all night." I stood in the center of the kitchen, my heart turning to ice. The golden couple was dead. Now there was only the hunter and the prey, and I was tired of being the prey. The heavy thud of the cabin door swinging open echoed like a gunshot in the cramped space. Mark's flashlight beam cut through the darkness, jagged and frantic, until it landed on me. I was standing by the hearth, the crowbar still gripped in my hand, the waterproof case clutched against my chest. The smell of his expensive sandalwood cologne, so familiar and once so comforting, now felt like a suffocating layer of filth in the air. "Sarah," he said, his voice dropping the worried husband act instantly. It became low, dangerous, and vibrating with a frantic energy. "Put the case down. You weren't supposed to find that. You weren't even supposed to be looking." "I wasn't supposed to find out you murdered my grandmother either, was I?" My voice was surprisingly steady, though my insides felt like they were liquefying. My heart was hammering so hard I could feel the pulse in my fingertips. "Or that you've been forging my name on mineral rights and life insurance policies." "How long, Mark? How long have I been a paycheck to you?" Mark took a step forward, the floorboards groaning under his weight. He looked disheveled, his hair windswept and his eyes wide, rimmed with a desperate, manic red. "It's not like that. We were in over our heads, Sarah. The investment in the downtown project, it went south. I owed people, dangerous people. I did this for us, to save our life." "For us?" I let out a jagged, hysterical laugh. "You took out a policy on my life for $2 million, Mark. Was that to save our life too? Or was that your retirement plan once the accident happened here?" He stopped, his flashlight beam wavering. For a long, agonizing moment, he said nothing. He stared at his expensive Italian leather boots, his jaw working silently. This was the man I had slept next to for 7 years. I waited for a denial, for a shred of the man I thought I knew to emerge and tell me I was wrong. But the silence stretched, heavy and damning. He couldn't even look me in the eye. "Mark, look at me," I whispered. "Look at me and tell me you weren't going to let me die in this cabin." He didn't look up. He just mumbled, "You don't understand how much pressure I was under. My mother, she said it was the only way." "Oh, for heaven's sake, Mark, stop sniveling," a sharp, familiar voice rang out from the doorway. Evelyn stepped into the cabin, her silk scarf replaced by a sturdy trench coat, her face a mask of cold, aristocratic fury. She didn't look like a grandmotherly figure anymore. She looked like a predator that had finally tired of the hunt. She held a small silver thermos in one hand and a heavy manila envelope in the other. "You always were too soft," she snapped at her son. Then she turned her gaze to me, her eyes like chips of flint. "It's a shame, Sarah. You really were a lovely addition to the family for a time, but you became an obstacle. Eleanor was an obstacle, too. She was sitting on a fortune in lithium and rare earth minerals, letting it rot while we were facing ruin. She refused to sell, even when I offered her a generous percentage. She called it blood money. She was always so dramatic." "You killed her," I said, the realization hitting me with a fresh wave of nausea. "Those vitamins you insisted she take, and the coffee you've been making for me every morning for the last month. That's why I've been so tired, isn't it? Why I couldn't think straight." Evelyn smiled, a thin, cruel line. "A very mild sedative, dear. Just enough to make you compliant. Just enough to make your accidental fall from the porch seem like a tragic result of your grief and exhaustion. It's a very clean plan. Or it was, until you decided to play detective." She tossed the manila envelope onto the kitchen table. It skidded across the dust, stopping inches from my hand. Sign the final transfer of the Blackwood tract to the shell company. Do it now, and we can discuss a different arrangement, perhaps a quiet divorce and a comfortable settlement. But if you don't— She glanced at the shadows of the cabin. Well, Mark is very strong, and accidents happen so easily in the wilderness. You're insane, I breathed. You think I'd sign anything after what you've done? I think you'd be surprised what you'll do to keep breathing, Evelyn countered. But then, the first real twist hit them. I felt a surge of cold, sharp clarity, the kind Eleanor always said came right before a storm. You're too late anyway, Evelyn, I said, my voice gaining a hard edge. I already looked at the geological surveys Eleanor kept in the hidden compartment, the ones you didn't find because you were too busy looking for deeds. There is no lithium here. Not anymore. Evelyn's face paled. What? That's impossible. The preliminary scans— The preliminary scans were faked, I interrupted, leaning into the lie with everything I had, seeing the doubt flicker in Mark's eyes. Eleanor knew you were sniffing around years ago. She was a geologist, remember? She salted the soil samples she knew you'd steal. She led you into a trap. This land is worthless. It's a toxic waste site from the old mining days. If you try to develop this, the EPA will shut you down in 48 hours and seize everything you have left. Mark gasped, his head snapping toward his mother. Mom, is that true? Did you check the core samples yourself? Of course I didn't check them myself, you idiot. I hired experts, Evelyn screamed, her composure finally shattering. The experts you hired were probably paid off by Eleanor, I added, twisting the knife. She knew you better than you knew yourselves. She knew your greed would be your blind spot. She's lying, Evelyn hissed, though her voice wavered. She's trying to stall. Mark, take the case from her, now. Mark moved toward me, his face a mask of conflicted agony. Sarah, just give it to me, please. Don't make me do this. Do what, Mark? I stepped back, my heels clicking against the cellar door. Kill the woman you promised to cherish? For a pile of poisoned dirt? Look at your mother. She's already planning how to blame you for all of this when the police arrive. You think she's going to share the insurance money? You're her fall guy, Mark. You always have been. The second twist was the look on Mark's face, not of realization, but of total, pathetic defeat. He didn't deny it. He didn't defend his mother. He just stopped, his shoulders sagging, his flashlight pointing at the floor. She's right, isn't she? Mark whispered, looking at Evelyn. The offshore accounts, they're all in your name. If Sarah dies here, I'm the one who gets investigated. I'm the one who goes to prison if the accident looks suspicious. Don't be a fool, Mark, Evelyn shrieked. In the chaos of their argument, I felt the click inside me. The fear didn't vanish, but it transformed. It turned into a cold, clinical rage. I wasn't just Sarah, the grieving granddaughter or the betrayed wife. I was an architect. I knew how structures worked. I knew where the weak points were. And I knew exactly where Eleanor had hidden the second key, the one that didn't open a door, but closed a trap. You want the truth about this cabin? I shouted over their bickering, my hand reaching for the iron ring bolt beneath the rug. The truth is, Eleanor didn't leave me a ruin. She left me a weapon, and you two just walked right into the center of it. The click wasn't just the sound of the ring bolt in the floorboards. It was the sound of my soul snapping back into place, harder and sharper than before. The fear that had been a cold lump in my throat for hours evaporated, replaced by a crystalline, predatory calm. I looked at Mark, his face pale and sweating under the flickering flashlight, and then at Evelyn, whose features were twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated malice. You think this cabin is a ruin, Evelyn? I said, my voice dropping an octave, becoming as steady as the stones in the hearth. You think Eleanor was just an old woman lost in the past? You didn't know her at all. She was an architect of environments. She knew how to build things to last, and she knew how to build things that could collapse on command. I didn't wait for them to move. I yanked the iron ring bolt. It wasn't a cellar door that opened, but a heavy, concealed steel shutter that slammed down over the only door to the cabin, triggered by a weighted pulley system Eleanor had rigged decades ago. The boom echoed like thunder, shaking the very foundation. The windows, reinforced with hidden plexiglass layers, were now the only exits, and they were too narrow for a grown man, let alone a woman in a trench coat. "What have you done?" Evelyn shrieked, lunging toward the door. She clawed at the steel, her manicured nails screeching against the metal. "Mark, open it! Do something!" But Mark didn't move. He stood in the center of the room, the flashlight trembling in his hand, casting long, frantic shadows against the walls. This was the golden husband, the man I had built a life with, reduced to a paralyzed statue of cowardice. He looked at the steel door, then at me, and finally, he did what he always did when things got difficult. He went silent. He didn't defend his mother. He didn't attack me. He just stood there, his mouth slightly open, a hollow shell of a human being. "It's over, Mark," I said, stepping toward him. I didn't flinch when he flinched. The moment I found that waterproof case, I didn't just read the papers. I used the satellite phone Eleanor kept in the emergency kit, the one you never bothered to look for because you were too busy scouting for minerals. I called my attorney. I called the sheriff, and I emailed high-resolution photos of every single forged signature and that little accident note from Evelyn to a private investigator I hired the day you lost my grandmother's deeds. Evelyn turned, her face purple with rage. "You're bluffing. You've been here for hours. You haven't had time." "I had all the time in the world, Evelyn, because you thought I was a victim," I countered, the words feeling like ice on my tongue. "You thought I was the same girl who let you pick out her wedding china and dictate her holiday schedule. But that girl died the moment I realized you killed the only person who truly loved me." I reached into the pocket of my jacket and pulled out a small black digital recorder. I pressed play. Evelyn's voice filled the room, crisp and clear. "The accident needs to happen here. The old woman's death was easy. This shouldn't be any harder." The silence that followed the recording was deafening. Even Evelyn seemed to shrink, the reality of her situation finally piercing through her delusion of grandeur. Mark finally found his voice, but it was a pathetic, whimpering thing. "Sarah, please," he breathed. "I can fix this. I'll tell them it was all her. I'll testify. I'll say she forced me. Just open the door. We can go home. We can forget this happened." I looked at him, and for the first time in 7 years, I felt absolutely nothing. No love, no hate, just a profound sense of waste. "There is no we, Mark. There is only a crime scene and a witness, and I am the witness who is going to watch you both burn." The blue and red lights of the sheriff's cruisers began to dance through the trees, reflecting off the cabin's dusty windows. The distant wail of sirens grew louder, a chorus of justice coming to claim the monsters in the woods. The retribution was swift and clinical. The police found the physical evidence of the forgeries, the hidden sedative in the thermos Evelyn had brought, and the digital recording that tied it all together. They also found the traces of the vitamins in Eleanor's medicine cabinet that Evelyn hadn't had time to clear out. My grandmother's body was exhumed a week later, and the toxicology report was the final nail in their coffin. Evelyn was charged with first-degree murder and conspiracy. She died in a state prison 2 years into her life sentence, alone, in a cell that was much smaller and colder than the ruin she had despised. Mark, the coward to the end, took a plea deal, turning on his mother in exchange for a reduced sentence for fraud and conspiracy. He lost his license, his reputation, and every cent he had ever tried to steal. When he was released 4 years later, he had nothing, no house, no mother, and no wife. The epilogue of my life began on a crisp autumn morning, 6 months after the trial ended. I was sitting on the porch of the cabin, the real cabin. It wasn't a ruin anymore. I had used my architectural skills to restore it, keeping the ancient cedar logs but opening it up to the light, with floor-to-ceiling glass that looked out over the Blackwood Valley. The worthless land turned out to be anything but. There was no lithium, That part of my lie had been true, but there was a massive, untapped underground spring of the purest mineral water in the region. Eleanor had known it all along. She had left me a sustainable, life-giving legacy, not a quick-fix lottery ticket for predators. I started a boutique bottling company that funded a sanctuary for the very wilderness Mark had wanted to bulldoze. I sat there with a cup of coffee, the steam rising into the cool mountain air. The silence was no longer heavy or suffocating. It was full of the rustle of leaves and the distant song of a hawk. I looked at the heavy brass key sitting on the table next to me, the same key that had once felt like a lead weight. Now it was light, a symbol of a door that had been closed forever on a life of lies. I realized then that Eleanor hadn't just left me a house or a forest. She had left me the truth about myself. She had forced me into the wilderness so I could find the steel in my own spine. As I watched the sun dip below the ridge, I thought about the golden couple we used to be. We were a house built on sand, beautiful on the outside but hollow to the core. Now, I was a woman built on stone, and the most powerful thing I learned is that you don't need a fortress to be safe. You just need to be the person who knows where the traps are hidden. I stood up, stretched, and walked inside, locking the door behind me. Not to keep the world out, but because I finally knew exactly who held the key.